Somewhere in central Mexico, there is a city so large, so carefully planned, so perfectly built, that when a completely different civilization discovered it centuries later, they thought only gods could have made it. They were not wrong to think that. This city had pyramids bigger than most in Egypt. It had roads, apartment buildings, markets, and water canals. At its peak, around 400 AD, over 125,000 people lived here. Wasn't that made it one of the 6 largest cities on the entire planet at that time? And yet, nobody knows who built it. Not the name of its first king. Not the language its people spoke. Not the name they gave to their own city. Nothing. When the Aztecs found this place, centuries after it had already collapsed, they were so amazed and so confused that they named it themselves. They called it Teotihuacan. In their language, Nahuatl, that means the place where gods were created. Think about that for a second. The Aztecs, one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world, stood in front of this city and said, "We don't know who made this. It must have been gods." That is how impressive this place was. And that is how completely its builders vanished from history. For hundreds of years, archaeologists dug, studied, and argued. They found murals, obsidian tools, pottery, and thousands of graves, but no royal tomb. No written records, no name. Then, in 2023, a team of scientists from Toho University School of Medicine in Japan, led by Dr. Fuzuki Mizuno, did something that had never been successfully done before. They extracted complete mitochondrial DNA, the full genetic blueprint, from human remains buried inside Teotihuacan, remains that had been sitting in volcanic soil for over 1,500 years, soil that should have destroyed every trace of DNA inside them. But the technology worked. And what it found was not what anyone expected. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And here's something worth thinking about. Have you ever taken a DNA ancestry test? Because by the end of this video, you might feel like you should. Because what we found inside these ancient graves connects to millions of people alive today. People who have no idea they are carrying one of history's greatest mysteries inside their own blood. The DNA results were supposed to confirm what we already suspected. Instead, they opened a door that no one was prepared to walk through. Because when scientists looked at those ancient genomes, the first thing they found was that these people did not come from one place. They came from everywhere. Let's go back to the very beginning of Teotihuacan. Not the famous pyramids, not the murals. The very first people who arrived here, around 200 to 100 BC, on a flat valley in central Mexico. Who were they? A major study published in PLOS1, using ancient DNA and a technique called strontium isotope analysis, gave us the first real answer, and it was stunning. The people buried in Teotihuacan's oldest residential districts, places like the neighborhood of Teopancasco, were not from one group. They were not one tribe. They were not one culture. They came from at least 3 completely different regions. Some carried genetic and chemical signatures from the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Others came from the highlands of what is now Tlaxcala, Puebla, and Hidalgo. And some came from regions even further away, origins that still don't match any single modern group cleanly. Now here is the part that makes this real. Strontium isotope analysis doesn't just look at DNA, and it looks at the chemical makeup of your teeth, and your teeth form in childhood. They absorb the minerals from the water and food of wherever you grew up. So when scientists analyze someone's tooth enamel, they can tell, not guess, not estimate. They can tell where that person physically grew up. And these people grew up somewhere else. They came to Teotihuacan as adults, outsiders, strangers. Dr. Linda Manzanilla of UNAM, one of the world's leading experts on Teotihuacan, found that 32% of formal burials in Teopancasco showed signs of being migrants from different regions. Some of them were even decapitated individuals, likely sacrificed, who also came from outside the city. This city was not built by one people with one identity. It was built by strangers from every direction who came together in one valley and decided to build something that the world had never seen. But why did they all come? What pulled 125,000 people from across Mesoamerica to the same spot? Part of the answer is practical. A volcanic eruption in the 1st century AD destroyed settlements across the Central Valley, forcing thousands of people to flee. Many came here. Then, around 320 AD, another eruption sent another wave of migrants. But the other part of the answer is stranger, more powerful, more disturbing. It's buried 30 meters beneath the Pyramid of the Moon, and it required blood. Japanese archaeologist Saburo Sugiyama has spent decades digging beneath the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan. What he found there changed how we understand this city forever. Beneath the pyramid, his team uncovered over 200 sacrificial burials, bound individuals, men buried with their hands tied behind their backs, bodies placed alongside the remains of jaguars, pumas, wolves, and eagles, ritual offerings of obsidian blades, pyrite mirrors, Yaren shells from distant coasts. But it's what the isotope analysis of those sacrificed individuals revealed that truly shocks. Many of them were not from Teotihuacan. Their teeth told a different story, one of childhood spent far away. Some came from the Maya lowlands, some from the Pacific coast. Teotihuacan was not just pulling in migrants who wanted to live here, it was pulling in people from across the known world, to die here. And this was not random. In the burial chambers beneath the pyramid are not chaos. They are organized by direction, east, west, north, south, as if the city was performing a ritual that said, "We have consumed every corner of the world, and now we are complete." Think about what that means. This city built its most powerful monuments by filling the ground beneath them with people from every civilization it could reach. It was not just a city. It was a machine, designed to absorb the world into itself. And here is the detail that no one talks about enough. Some of those sacrificed individuals were buried in full Teotihuacan ceremonial clothing. Their original identity, wherever they came from, was stripped away. They were dressed as citizens of this city. As if even in death, Teotihuacan was saying, "You belong to us now." But here's the real question. If the sacrificed came from everywhere, then who were the people doing the sacrificing? Who designed all of this? Who were the priests and architects at the very center of this machine? Their DNA points somewhere that nobody predicted, not south, not east, not toward the Maya or the Gulf Coast, north into the desert. The elite burials at Teotihuacan, the individuals identified by their jade ornaments, their placement near temple cores, their ceremonial positioning, carry a genetic signal that researchers have spent years trying to explain. It connects to the American Southwest, in two populations who spoke languages in the Proto-Uto-Aztecan family. The ancestor language of Nahuatl, the same language the Aztecs spoke centuries later, but also the ancestor of Hopi, Comanche, and Shoshone, languages spoken by peoples of the desert north in what is now New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. Linguists had argued for decades that Nahuatl did not originate in central Mexico. They believed it came from the north, from desert-dwelling people who migrated south over many generations. Mainstream historians largely dismissed this idea. The DNA does not dismiss it. The genetic signal in Teotihuacan's priestly layer matches populations who, based on linguistic evidence, would have come from exactly that northern desert world. Try to picture that for a moment. The architects of the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere, the people who designed the Pyramid of the Sun, the priests who performed the rituals. They may have grown up in a world of red rock canyons and open desert sky, and carried that memory all the way south, encoding it into stone temples in a tropical valley. Teotihuacan was not just a city where different people lived together. It was a place where completely different worlds, the desert north, the tropical south, the coastal east, fused into one new identity. And for a while, it worked. But around 350 AD, something begins to change. What the genetic signal of this northern priestly lineage, the desert founders, starts to weaken in the burial record. And within a century, it disappears almost completely. Not because these people died out, but because something was quietly replacing them from the inside. Between 350 and 450 AD, Teotihuacan does not fall. It does not burn. There is no war, no invasion, no dramatic collapse. Instead, something quieter and more unsettling happens. Our archaeologists call it the Xolalpan reorganization. Apartment compounds across the city are restructured. Murals, including some of the most elaborate painted walls in Mesoamerican history, are plastered over, covered up, hidden. The ritual offering deposits change character. The types of objects buried under floors shift. The genetic profiles in elite burials show increasing admixture from Zapotec and Mixtec populations, groups from what is now Oaxaca, hundreds of kilometers to the south. But nobody conquered Teotihuacan during this period. There are no signs of military force. What happened instead was slower and in many ways more powerful. A biological and cultural absorption happening one generation at a time. New families rising, old lineages fading, the city changing its face without ever announcing it. And it was happening at exactly the moment Teotihuacan was projecting its power outward more aggressively than ever before. In 378 AD, right in the middle of this internal transformation, a figure connected to Teotihuacan arrived at the Maya city of Tikal and took control of it. Historical records confirmed by DNA evidence show that Teotihuacan's military and political reach extended deep into the Maya world at this exact time. A civilization changing its identity at home while exporting its mythology abroad. A city painting over its own memory while convincing other civilizations to adopt it. But you cannot sustain that kind of contradiction forever. The gap between what Teotihuacan was and what it was becoming kept growing. The old lineages faded. The new power structures competed with each other, and by 550 AD, the city was ready to break. The fire didn't come from outside, it came from within. In 550 AD, fire swept through Teotihuacan. Not the whole city. That is the detail that matters most. The apartment blocks where ordinary people lived, the farmers, the craftsmen. With the market workers, those were untouched. Only the temples burned, only the palaces, only the buildings along the Street of the Dead, the ceremonial spine of the city, the heart of elite power. Dr. Linda Manzanilla of UNAM, using radiocarbon dating and archaeomagnetic analysis of burned floors, pinpointed the collapse at around 570 AD. Her study, published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, concluded clearly, no traces of foreign invasion are visible at the site. This was not an enemy army. This was the people of Teotihuacan itself. She described it as a violent clash between two opposing ways of exercising power, a moment when the neighborhoods, the craftsmen, the intermediate elite who had been building wealth and status for generations, finally turned on the governing council at the top. The Zala Palace, where Teotihuacan's co-governors lived, was raided and burned, and the sculptures inside were shattered, and across the city, sacred statues were systematically decapitated. Temple floors were ripped open, offering caches were destroyed. This was not looting. This was ritual destruction, the deliberate killing of sacred objects. In Mesoamerican tradition, you don't just destroy a building. You kill its spiritual power. You unmake it. 125,000 people watched their gods burn. And here is the deepest part of all of this. The DNA from the burials in the aftermath shows a sharp collapse in elite genetic diversity. The complex, multi-ethnic ruling bloodlines that had governed this city for 500 years, gone within 2 generations. The people who built this civilization destroyed it themselves, but they did not disappear. 125,000 people were still alive, and over the next 200 years, they began to move, in every direction, carrying with them the DNA, the rituals, and the memory of the greatest city in the ancient Americas. And everywhere they went, they left a mark that science is only now beginning to read. When a civilization collapses, history usually forgets the survivors. It focuses on the ruins, the burned temples, the empty streets, the silence. But the people of Teotihuacan didn't vanish into silence. They scattered, and what they scattered into was extraordinary. Ancient DNA evidence and archaeological records from Maya sites show that after Teotihuacan's fall, its genetic and cultural fingerprint began appearing across Mesoamerica. Maya kings, ruling cities hundreds of kilometers away, centuries after Teotihuacan had already burned, were still celebrating military victories by dressing as Teotihuacan warriors, still building in Teotihuacan's architectural style, still invoking the symbols of a city their grandparents' may have fled. At Capan, in modern-day Honduras, with DNA evidence from royal burials shows rulers with measurable Teotihuacan-associated ancestry. Teotihuacan did not just trade with the Maya world, It planted its bloodline inside Maya royal courts. And this is the twist. The Teotihuacan diaspora did not arrive as homeless refugees begging for shelter. They arrived carrying prestige. Their bloodline, their building knowledge, their pyramid planning, all of it functioned as a kind of currency. See, new rulers across Mesoamerica wanted Teotihuacan ancestry in their lineage because it made them legitimate. It connected them to the greatest civilization the continent had ever seen. The city was gone, but its DNA became a throne, and it didn't stop there. Dr. Mizuno's 2024 study, published in the Annals of Human Biology, confirmed that haplogroups A2, B2, UND1, the core genetic markers of ancient Teotihuacan civilians, are still present today at elevated frequencies in indigenous communities in Puebla, Oaxaca, and the Yucatan. 15 million living people carry a piece of this story inside their cells. But one group carries something even more specific, something that stopped researchers in the middle of a routine genetic survey. A community in the mountains of Puebla whose DNA doesn't just show a general Central Mesoamerican pattern, it matches Teotihuacan's founding layer almost exactly. In northern Puebla, in a mountainous region that most people outside Mexico have never heard of, researchers conducting a genetic survey of indigenous Totonac and Nahuan communities found something unexpected. The haplogroup frequencies, particularly haplogroup A2, shade the most dominant genetic marker in ancient Teotihuacan's earliest civilian burials, were clustering in this population at levels that matched the founding layer of Teotihuacan more closely than any other living group tested. Let that sink in. While the rest of Teotihuacan's population scattered across the continent, seeding Maya courts and Oaxacan valleys and distant Pacific communities, one group, it seems, never went far. They stayed within 200 kilometers of the city their ancestors built, and for 2,000 years. And they brought something else with them. Ethnographers working in this region have documented an elderly ritual practice, performed by older members of the community, involving obsidian blades, directional offerings, and a chant structure, a ritual with no name in any formally recorded Mesoamerican tradition, a ritual that linguistic analysts say echoes phonemic patterns from before Nahuatl fully formed, pre-Nahuatl sounds, ancient sounds. And nobody taught them this from a book. There is no book. It was passed from grandmother to granddaughter, father to son, for 80 generations. When researchers shared the genetic findings with one elderly woman from this community, that her family's DNA matched the founders of Teotihuacan, she said something that stopped everyone in the room. She said her family had always known they came from the place where the gods were made. That phrase, passed down through generations. No written source, no formal history, just memory held in the body, outlasting every empire that came after. Her oral tradition was not mythology. It was genetic memory, alive, unbroken, waiting to be recognized. But if these people carry the founding DNA, then what they remember, what they practice, what their ancestors chose not to write down, that becomes the most important surviving record of Teotihuacan we have. And the fact that this city never wrote anything down at all, that was not an accident. Here is the single most frustrating fact about Teotihuacan. In 600 years, with 125,000 people, with sophisticated art, astronomy, engineering, and a trade network that reached thousands of miles, not one single line of written language has ever been found here, not one word. Every other major civilization of that era left writing. The Maya had one of the most complex writing systems in history. The Zapotecs had writing. Even smaller cultures left inscriptions. Teotihuacan, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, left nothing. For a long time, historians assumed the writing simply hadn't been found yet, that it was lost, or burned, or buried somewhere still undiscovered. But a different theory is now gaining serious attention. When researchers cross-reference the genetic data with linguistic history, something interesting emerges. The founding population of Teotihuacan was multilingual. The northern desert lineage spoke Proto-Uto-Aztecan. The Gulf Coast founders likely spoke a Totonac family language. Other groups brought other tongues entirely. No single group's script could have represented everyone. So the hypothesis, now backed by genetic evidence, is that Teotihuacan made a deliberate choice, a political choice. Instead of allowing one group's writing system to dominate and therefore give that group power over history, the city used shared ritual instead of shared text, shared symbols, shared murals, shared ceremony. A civilization so advanced that it understood the political danger of written language and designed a system of unity that didn't need it. Every group was symbolically equal because no group controlled the written record. It was, in a strange way, each one of the most sophisticated governance decisions in ancient history, but it also meant that when the city fell, everything fell with it. No texts, no histories, no names, only bones and the DNA inside them. And yet the Aztecs, who came 700 years later, were absolutely terrified of this place. They didn't avoid it. They made pilgrimages here. They buried their most sacred objects beneath its pyramids. And their own DNA tells us exactly why they were so afraid. But when the Aztecs built their empire, one of the most powerful military states in the ancient Americas, they did something strange. They kept looking backward, not at their own history, at Teotihuacan's. They incorporated this ruined, burned, abandoned city into the center of their creation mythology. They said the sun and the moon were born here. They called it the birthplace of the current age of the world. They made it sacred. Aztec emperors made personal pilgrimages to this broken city. And archaeologists excavating the Aztec Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid Temple at the heart of their capital, Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, have recovered thousands of buried offerings, among them Teotihuacan-era artifacts, objects already 800 years old when the Aztecs buried them, treated not as antiques, but as holy relics. Why would the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica worship the ruins of a city that had been dead for 700 years? The DNA gives us one part of the answer. Our genetic analysis of Aztec elite burials shows a measurable Teotihuacan-associated ancestry signal in the ruling class. The Aztec nobility carried Teotihuacan blood, and they knew it. Just as European kings claimed descent from Rome to prove their right to rule, the Aztec elite used their Teotihuacan ancestry as political legitimacy. But there is a darker layer. Aztec oral histories do not describe Teotihuacan as a glorious empire to be admired, but that they describe it as a place of gods who destroyed themselves, a cautionary place, a place where power consumed itself from the inside. They feared it because they remembered what happened there in 570 AD, not from books, not from records, but from the same kind of generational memory we saw in that elderly woman in Puebla, passed mouth to ear, parent to child, across every generation that came after the fire. The greatest empire in Mesoamerica built its holiest temple and buried its most sacred objects beneath the shadow of a city it was afraid of. Think about what that means. Teotihuacan's collapse was so traumatic, so defining, that it shaped the mythology, the politics, and the spiritual life of every civilization that came after it for the next 1,000 years. But here is what no one in that Aztec court could have known. Some of the people who set that fire in 570 AD, the ones who burned the temples and shattered the statues, they didn't stay. They moved. They walked north. And the DNA trail they left behind leads somewhere that changes the entire map of ancient America. New ancient DNA research, combining population modeling with archaeological evidence, has found something that breaks the story wide open one final time. Or Teotihuacan-associated genomic signatures are appearing in ancestral Pueblo populations of the American Southwest, but not before the city's rise, after its collapse, after 700 AD. Let that direction sink in for a moment. Earlier in this story, we found a desert origin ghost lineage embedded in Teotihuacan's priestly class, a signal pointing north, suggesting that desert people migrated south to help found the city. That was the first migration, but the DNA now shows a second movement. After the collapse, after the burning, some of Teotihuacan's survivors moved north, back toward the desert, back toward the ancestral homeland of the people who may have started it all. The cliff dwellings of Chaco Canyon, the great kivas of the ancestral Puebloans, the astronomical alignments carved into desert rock. Researchers are now asking whether these structures carry something more than influence from Teotihuacan, whether they carry actual memory, brought north in the bodies of survivors. A bloodline that traveled south 2,000 years ago, built the greatest city in the hemisphere, watched it burn, and then walked home. 3,000 kilometers, 2,000 years, one genetic thread, running from a desert plateau in the north down into a valley in central Mexico, through pyramids and sacrifice and fire and diaspora, and back north again into the cliff walls of New Mexico. And yet, the most important question is still unanswered, which we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their creation story. We do not know the name of the first god whose pyramid they raised. We do not know the language they spoke to each other across the street of the dead on an ordinary morning. The DNA proves they existed. It traces where they came from and where they went. It connects them to millions of living people across Mexico and the American Southwest. But the meaning of their existence, what they believed, what they hoped for, what they were building toward, that is still buried in silence. Right now, somewhere in a laboratory, a researcher is sequencing the genome of a child buried beneath the Avenue of the Dead 1,800 years ago. And in a village in Puebla, an elderly woman is preparing an obsidian offering, the same way her grandmother taught her, the same way her grandmother's grandmother taught before that, with no written instructions, no formal name, no explanation. And they are both touching the same story, from opposite ends of time. Teotihuacan did not disappear. It scattered itself into everything, into bloodlines, into myths, into the cells of people alive today who carry a civilization inside them without knowing its name. The question is no longer who built this city. The question is, what did they know that we have completely forgotten?